this on? Yeah. Hi guys. I hope everyone's got a bit of energy. I know that like a deep dive into MMM isn't necessarily the most exciting thing to finish a day on, but I'm hoping we'll bring you a few things in here for food to thought. I'm pretty nervous about this because I've decided that the best way to kick this off in Google's offices in front of an entire room of my peers and the digital marketing industry as a whole is to start by saying, I fundamentally think we've all made a deal with the devil, and that devil's name is Last Click Attribution. Yeah? Can I get an amen? No? Or a boo? I don't. I think going into this, as an industry, seldom budgets get signed off without showing an immediate return. We are addicted to this concept of ROAS and return on investment. We sit in front of finance teams and we say, give us £1 million, we'll give you 6 million back. But the trouble is the method by which we've been doing this for the last 20 plus years is fundamentally flawed. The basis of what we do, the basis of the value we show we do has massive issues we'll go into. I mean, I think people kind of get this when you think about search. You might click on an ad, you go through and purchase it. But outside of search, who clicks on ads? Like half of the data that we have about people engaging with our ads aren't even available within the system that measure ROAS in that way. And I think it's probably important to say that no one's at fault. It's not Google, it's not agencies, it's not digital marketing teams. But over the years, we've basically found the biggest point of value we point to as fundamental and I would say significant issues with it. I cheered up when I started writing this and thought we'd start on such a somber note. And I think what I wanted to do is give a little bit of a more balanced view of exactly where these issues lie. Starting with the positives, there are actually, when we look at digital attribution as a whole, we're talking about platform data, we're talking about last click, we're talking about GA, etc. It's live data. That's really powerful for us. The fact that we have a immediate and constant feedback of what is working and isn't. And as a result, we use it to drive algorithmic optimizations, which drives a lot of performance for our campaigns. And accessibility is a really important thing for that data as well. But on the flip side, I think it's based on an assumption without a statistical basis. We're saying people click, therefore they bought. The platforms that use the models tend to suit their products, and people will know this. If you've spent time in GA, you'll see that search does incredibly well. You spend time in Meta does incredibly well. And we end up with this sort of system where we can't really compare and contrast the different points of data we have. And there's also an incomplete view of the data as it's not shared between platforms. So someone could watch an entire video, but because there's no click, and because perhaps that impression doesn't feed through to the other system by which you're measuring it, those engagements are entirely lost. So we get this issue where we can see that this type of data is fundamentally flawed, but at the same time it's fundamentally essential and feeds everything we do. On the scale of bad to good, platform data, I mean, if you look in a specific platform, it's just showing you the measurement for that platform itself. There's no deduping, there's no crossover, and we find that those insights we get are particularly suited to those platforms. Something like analytics, something like GA does a slightly better job. It feeds a few more data signals in. We're able to dedupe between different sources to some degree, but there's a huge amount of data they still don't see. We've tried to address it through things like data-driven attribution, multi-touch, and even then, I think what we find is that there's still, because the core data that feeds into it is still based around last click and last impression attribution, and it still doesn't see all of what's happening on other platforms, we still have issues. But then weirdly, platform data, as much as it's arguably the sort of lowest quality of those data signals, it's actually the best in terms of when we run a campaign in Meta, it's optimizing towards metadata. Platform data we can't step away from that entirely. The platform data is always going to feed what we do to a large degree. And so I think it helps us to take a little step back and say, what makes good measurement? What is an ideal measurement solution? And I split up into three areas. So accessibility, is that data readily accessible? Is it live? Does it feed into platforms? And can it integrate with the platforms we're using? Accuracy, does the data reflect business performance accurately? And we'll go into that in a bit more detail, but does the attribution model actually reflect how well the business is doing? How statistically reliable are insights? And can we show a level of incrementality? Do we get past just correlation to show some causation? And we ran this campaign and therefore this happened. And lastly, we want it to be comprehensive. So is the data consistent across all activity? How can I measure cross-platform? Does it treat different platforms in the same way? How can we look at offline and offline channels? We obviously have all got a huge big focus on digital, but we run lots of other marketing activities on different platforms as well. And lastly, can I measure online and offline sales? I think for too long we've spent thinking digital drives digital sales and TV drives people into store. Well, that's just not human behavior. That's completely irrational. And I think for too long our measurement systems have been set up to look as if that's how we expect people to behave. So stepping away from platform data, stepping away from digital attribution models, we can overlay incrementality studies. So these we kind of touched upon on last door. They can be really effective in showing us really what the incremental effect of activity can be. We run a holdout group that doesn't see an ad and target an ad to the other group, and look at the difference between the response and control and expose. You can statistically say that difference is due to the marketing you ran. So they're really powerful in showing what we do actually drives the sale. What we do is actually having the effect that we want it to have, and a massive improvement on what we see from a sort of arbitrary digital attribution model. On the flip side, however, they are quite difficult to ensure consistency between studies. Again, platforms run their own type of setup. You would have to, you can't always pay for a third party to come in and treat all different platforms equally. And so you tend to be focusing on exactly what that campaign on that platform has done. And they are time and resource heavy. They take quite a lot of effort to set up, but I think they still play a part. And so what we see amongst these two sort of main options we have, one is offering short-term control, digital attribution models. They're very accessible. We can optimize towards them and integrate them easily into the campaigns we're running. Incrementality test really starts to deliver on the accuracy front. So we can really say, we ran this campaign and therefore this happened. But we find that we have this gap across this comprehensive pillar. And really, that's where media mix modeling comes into its own. It is a system which Stuart's going to go to in more detail that fundamentally treats all platforms in the same way. It looks at correlation. It looks at it doesn't treat search any different to how it treats TV or print or out-of-home media. And the quick question is why now? Why are people talking about it for so long? Econometrics was coined in the 1920s. I think in the 1960s it was first used for marketing, and probably right up until the sort of digital revolution, it was the main way in which companies, certainly large companies, could say what sales effect their marketing activity had. When we go into the digital revolution, MMM kind of fell out a little bit out of fashion. A lot of large companies continue to do econometrics and MMM studies the entire way through, but because of the cost to entry, it tend to be the larger companies doing it, and a whole section of the industry went on to focus on digital attribution, focus on digital metrics. And it fell out of fashion a little bit. But I think recently there has been a little bit more of an understanding of the limitations of digital measurement. There's an understanding of exactly where we need to fill in those gaps and where we need to bring a bit more consistency of how we look at the performance of what our campaigns do. And also advances in data and technology have lowered that cost to entry. So we're finding it's a very sort of popular and interesting thing to explore with companies at the moment. And I'll hand over to Stuart, who'll tell you exactly what it is.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to go into a brief introduction to MMM. Obviously, I sincerely apologize for the amount of times everyone's going to hear MMM coming forward. But I'll try demystify it a bit and just give a bit of background in it. So what essentially MMM is it's a model that allows us to ingest a very large amount of historic data, looking at all media, offline, online, and really comparing that to any metric, normally sales. But the key here is that we can essentially choose that metric to better understand the business. What MMM does is it basically looks at the correlation between what media is actually happening in the company and what's the outcome, how many sales are we making. And it does that in a very holistic way. So like with platform data, it's very specific to what you're trying to measure. With MMM, we're really trying to take a broad approach to this measurement. MMM also takes into account other sort of models on top of that without going into too much detail. So we do try to look at things like ad stock effects. So like Dimi mentioned, media taking between different channels. They all have different characteristics, and upper funnel might take 4 or 6 months to actually come into effect. So by applying all of these different sort of situations and models on top of each other, it really does become statistically rigorous. Looking at online and offline, it sort of allows us to treat all of them the same. We're comparing media activity to what's happening in the business. And again, that is why it is truly the most omni-channel measurement solution that we can actually look at. And also looking at injecting other parameters. So with MMM, a lot of the time it goes into designing projects. We're looking at what really makes this business different from the others, and we can inject not just media variables into the model, but looking at promotional data and anything else to really try and distinguish what media, what effect media has on sales, and we can really work out if media was stripped away, we have that baseline sales. So it really does become incremental. So going into sort of our view, I know everyone has sort of touched on this before, but there's really no silver bullet to measurement. So everyone's sort of spoken about platform data, attribution, incrementality, and MMM. And the way we see it is that MMM has to be used in this hierarchy. Not necessarily saying here that MMM is the cherry on top. It's just generally is the most sort of complex long-term solution to implement. So it's definitely worth starting at platform data, which is really available, and scaling up that way. But now that we know what MMM is, I guess I am biased towards it, but I want to sort of say that it is, again, not the best solution for everything. So if you are looking for the most granular insight to answer every single question, that is not what MMM is for. That would be more of an attribution or last click attribution or anything. If you've just launched a new channel, for example, MMM, because we need large amounts of historic data, again, there's a pitfall there. So we would look at geo experiments or any incrementality experiments there. And again, businesses always want to sort of say, what's my measurement now? MMM does take a long time to implement. There's a lot of data gathering, scoping, and development required. So there is that sort of long-term strategic project that really does require MMM to fit well in the business. But then where it does fit in, it does provide that long-term media activity effectiveness, more omni-channel, and really a holistic approach to measurement. So looking at sort of what MMM is and how we actually want to use it. So if we look at the process diagram on the left over there, we could really say that looks exactly like any other data process or framework, a framework for data projects. So we would typically generate one of these, and it's pretty much out of the box in exactly what a data project would look like. So scoping, data collection, development, and then insights and optimization. But that's not the case for MMM. In order to have an effective project, let's say, we do have to go back to what everyone's spoken about now, and it's really about building that foundation. So in order to sort of have an effective project, we do need other key partners involved. So we do need media teams, we do need the data team, but we also need the business as a whole. In order to do project scoping, the data team can scope a project out. We will be focused purely on how do we make the most accurate model in terms of prediction. But that means that when we give it to the media team, it's not actually actionable. So by having all of these key partners involved at critical points, having the media team, the business involved in scoping to actually design a project that we can activate really does go a long way. Then looking at some of the key outputs, I will try and whet your appetites, but not go into too much of the detail. So looking at the graph on the left, we can see that we can sort of pick out all the attributed sales by each metric. The nice thing about this is we can get that sort of incremental view, so we can understand what sales would come from the baseline without any media involved. We can look at any other non-media metrics as well in that, so like promotion data and things like that, which really does give you valuable insights into not just media buying and planning, but really strategic investments moving forward. Then looking at this graph over here, we can then also look at the efficiency of each channel, so looking at how much you're spending and that attributed revenue, and really looking at your return on investment for each of the channels. And then I will go into this briefly, but Tom will touch on this later, but we can actually see from here very briefly where you're underspending, where your efficiencies are, and try and pull those levers to work out where we should be moving as a business. And then, in my point of view, the two most important outputs is the saturation curves. So by modeling ad stock, channel synergies and everything all together, we can work out the diminishing returns for each of your channels. By placing our estimates on costs and everything, we can essentially get a much more accurate view on where you're currently spending in the channel, where the most incremental spending phases, and then work out where to go. So we can very easily see if you're overspending in some channels, what pulling back some of the spend would do, and vice versa. Using these curves, we can then also run budget optimizations, which will purely give you the most optimal budget split to maximize your revenue. But there's obviously a lot, and this is where bringing in those key partners comes in, is I can definitely do that, but there's always a case where the business says, well, we actually can't do that. So it's a fine line of saying, this is what I'm giving you, how can we actually make this work? And I think that's the key aspect. And I'll hand over back to Tom after that.
And then, so we've got all of the insights that MMM can get us. We then have to go into the process of media planning. What do we do with those insights? How does that affect what we do from a strategic perspective? We look at the different channels, and we can generally segment them into one of these four quadrants. So on the y-axis, we've got incrementality, on the x-axis, diminishing returns. Down in the bottom left, we find things that have a low IROAS, so they're not performing, but they are underinvested. Generally, you'll find that these are quite small pieces of activity, and really, when we're in here, the key thing with MMM is it's a historical read on what you ran. It's not an inherent value of what that channel can offer for you. If we're finding that things aren't working, continue to test. We can't pull everything that's not working. The second you pull it, it falls out of the system and you kind of don't get those insights back. So number one, always try and mend your strategy to make sure, see if we can turn something that has a low IROAS into something that has a little bit of a higher IROAS. On the right down here, having said that, there are some times where we see that there's low ROAS activities that are very overinvested, you may want to consider hitting the brakes, try and bring that down on the diminishing returns graph and make it a little bit more incremental. What you'll also notice, and this kind of aligns with the medium multiplier effect concept, so the more things you have live, the more overall effect you have to some degree. And you find that certain things, even if they're really not that incremental, at a low budget will deliver incremental revenue. And it's all about having lots of different options and a broad media mix overall. The really interesting bit, though, is up on this top half. So, the sweet spot is something that's very, very incremental and hasn't reached the point of diminishing returns. If it's high ROAS and it's underinvested, then go. Like, put more money into that, invest more. We know that it's going to drive incremental sales to your business. If it's slightly overinvested in high ROAS, these tend to be things that have a huge amount of money in them. So you can pull back even slightly to bring it into a little bit more of an efficient level on the diminishing returns graph, but you can use that money to fund lots of testing elsewhere. So these are the kind of two areas, and a lot of the optimizations we'll make really focus on those two quadrants. These are the big decisions we can make that are going to drive overall value for you as a business. And then what we do is we will give this into a sort of bit of scenario planning. This is hyper simplified, but let's say we can look at the current plan for the year, we get the insight, and we can run up two options. We can either approach this from a media mix perspective, or we can talk about it as a headroom perspective. From a media mix perspective, what we'd say is, move money from channel A to channel B, that's slightly more incremental, and what we'll show is along the bottom here that your MMM incremental revenue as a whole goes up. The problem with this is that your media mix has probably been decided off the pesky last click attribution model. And what you will almost guarantee find is that your analytics revenue will drop as a result. You're tending to take it from something that has showing well in the old way of measurement and putting it to something that wasn't necessarily showing well. And we'll come on to why that's important, but that's something that as a business you need to be kind of ready for and have answers for. We would much rather have scenario two. This is the headroom discussion. Fundamentally what we want to do is equip you as marketing teams with a language that speaks to the broader business as to how well all of your activity is doing. Generally speaking, we don't find things within MMM working terribly. Like, it tends to be a bit more of a fine-tuning optimization. And we often have a really good example from opportunity from a headroom perspective to say, you could invest this much more and you can get this much returns. We much prefer to work in this way. You find that all of the metrics go up. Overall, all the different stakeholders within a business are happy. But generally, we approach it, and we have to approach it in one of these two ways. And the golden rules of MMM optimization, I think the key thing is you need a strategic goal, which is long-term, systematic evolution, strategy and results. This isn't about going in, panicking and then changing all of your investment that used to look like this into what the MMM tells you. You have to be systematic. If we do every single thing that the MMM might suggest, you won't be able to point to any which one and say that really had the effect. So we limit our optimizations to one significant optimization per cycle. Otherwise, keep to an agreed level. So generally, moving 10% at a time every quarter. We have to have a long-term goal that we're looking for. Otherwise, we really lose a lot of the insight. Consider factors other than investment. As I said, like if your creative's rubbish and it's not working because of that, it's not really to do with media mix, it's to do with strategy. So have a regular check-in to see, is this because we think it's overinvested? Is it because we think it's not working? Or is it because there's something else with the strategy that's wrong? And I think, also the last point in terms of insight stops when investment does. So always try fix. It's much easier to slowly change, amend your strategy over time, and fix the problems you have than if you stop it entirely. The next quarter you won't have that read, so you don't know what it's doing at all at that point. So we like to implement these golden rules of optimization. Just make sure that we're being methodical and really thinking about how we set up this long-term project. And then just some very key watch outs. I said, like, stakeholder engagement is everything. You're fundamentally asking a business that your finance director is probably pretty used to looking in GA and saying we have X million pounds. If you give us this investment, we'll drive that again. We're asking them to consider a different metric, a metric that doesn't always align with it, quite often doesn't align with it. And so what we need to make sure is we have the buy-in of all stakeholders. Finance teams are absolutely key. If they're not bought in, they'll just say no, and you'll just carry on doing what you were doing anyway. Secondly, embed MMM as a planning culture. This is all about long-term growth. It's all about making sure that we have a goal to aim for in next quarter, the quarter after, the year after, and continue on that positive trajectory. Quarterly catch-ups, ensuring everyone's involved, ensuring that we're fully aligned on the planning process. We set up in a insight test and then retest kind of culture. That's really key. And I think lastly, very quickly, know the model limitations. Not everything's meant to drive short-term incremental ROAS. There are bits of your strategy that might be going after a new audience. It might be going after a younger audience that you traditionally haven't done. You'll think about the customer of tomorrow. Why should that drive an incremental ROAS in any system? Trust your intuition as a marketer. Say this type of activity shouldn't be reading from an incremental ROAS perspective, and really use this to leverage as very specific short and medium-term goals. And lastly, in the near future in a galaxy not very far away, MMM is going warp speed. We haven't really touched on this a huge amount, but we are developing seamless measurement, which is a new product suite from Incubeta. And really the big difference here is that we have a new bespoke UI that's going to make this much more intuitive, lead to much more agile insights. Data and technology is affecting everything, of course, and MMM is no different. The aim really is to bridge the gap between those short-term insights from a analytic and platform data perspective to the long-term insights of MMM and incrementality studies. How do we use data to ensure that those models and those calculations are quicker, are more manageable, more bespoke? And lastly, this is really exciting because it will let us access new testing capabilities. How can we bring in things like creative, things like audience, things like brand data into MMM and really understand everything that's going on. At the current sort of level of investment and resource, that's very, very difficult. But with this new sort of intuitive and data-led approach, we should be able to run these tests much easier. And in a much more fluid way. So if you're interested in MMM, I think there's never been a better time to be interested in it. Cost of barriers coming down, the product's getting better. So thank you very much for your time. And please come grab me or anyone else from Incubeta at the end if you're interested. And we'd love to have a discussion around this kind of product because I think this is the future and this is where it's going in the next year or so. Thank you.